She thought that finding the silver necklace in the attic was just a family keepsake. But when wild animals began to follow her and her wounds healed in minutes, she discovered that some blood secrets cannot remain hidden forever. And the Alpha who ruled the region with an iron fist was about to discover that his new Luna would not bow to anyone. The silver necklace burned against Serena's palm like a living ember, its intricate engravings pulsing with an energy that made her entire arm tremble. She had found it buried beneath moth-eaten quilts in the attic of her childhood home, wrapped in a piece of velvet so old it crumbled at her touch. For 26 years, she had lived in this house, walked past that attic door thousands of times, never knowing that her entire existence had been built upon a foundation of carefully constructed lies. The pendant was exquisite in its darkness, crafted from silver so pure it seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light filtering through the dusty window. Ancient symbols spiraled around its edges, symbols that meant nothing to her conscious mind, yet somehow felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. As she held it closer to examine the engravings, a sharp pain shot through her skull, accompanied by flashes of images that couldn't possibly be memories, yet felt more real than the wooden floor beneath her knees. A woman with her same green eyes, running through moonlit forests. The sound of howling that echoed not with menace, but with heartbreak. Blood on silver, silver on skin, skin that shifted and changed under starlight. Serena dropped the necklace as if it had bitten her, but the images didn't fade. They intensified, flooding her consciousness with sensations she had never experienced yet somehow recognized. The metallic taste of fear mixed with something wilder, something that made her teeth ache and her skin feel too tight. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to stop the visions, but they continued to pour through her mind like water through a broken dam. The sound of footsteps on the stairs below snapped her back to reality. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to Marcus, the community leader who had been her father's closest friend and her unofficial guardian since his death 5 years ago. Marcus, who had always spoken of tradition and order, who had guided the mountain community of Raven's Hollow with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. Marcus, who, she suddenly realized with crystalline clarity, had never once mentioned her mother beyond saying she had died when Serena was too young to remember. But the woman in her visions had been alive, vibrantly, desperately alive. Serena! Marcus's voice carried up the narrow staircase, warm and paternal as always, but now she detected something else beneath its surface, something that sounded almost like fear. "What are you doing up there, child?" Child, at 26, with a veterinary degree and a practice that served 3 neighboring communities, she was hardly a child. Yet Marcus had never stopped calling her that, never stopped treating her as if she were a fragile thing that might break if exposed to too much truth. She snatched the necklace from the floor, its metal now strangely cool against her skin, and shoved it into the pocket of her jeans. The moment it made contact with her body, a sense of completeness washed over her, as if a missing piece of herself had finally clicked into place. But alongside that completion came something else, something that made her hands shake and her heart race with anticipation mixed with dread. "Just looking through some old things," she called down, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I'll be down in a moment." But even as she said the words, she knew that the moment she descended those stairs, everything would change. The woman she had been when she climbed up here no longer existed. In her place stood someone who carried secrets in her bones, someone who had tasted power and found it both terrifying and intoxicating. The floorboards creaked under Marcus's weight as he climbed toward the attic. Panic fluttered in Serena's chest like a trapped bird. She couldn't let him see the necklace, couldn't let him know what she had found. Some instinct deeper than logic warned her that Marcus was connected to whatever had happened to her mother, whatever truth had been buried along with her memories. "Serena," his voice was closer now, tinged with an urgency that confirmed her suspicions. "Come down from there." That attic isn't safe, and there's nothing up there worth finding. But there was. The necklace proved that everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her very identity, was a carefully constructed illusion. And if Marcus was willing to lie about something this fundamental, what other truths had he hidden from her? She moved toward the small window, her body responding to impulses that felt both foreign and natural. Her senses, always keen thanks to her work with animals, had sharpened to an almost painful degree. She could smell the oil Marcus used on his hair, could hear the slight wheeze in his breathing that spoke of anxiety, could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. Most disturbing of all, she could smell something else on him, something wild and earthy that reminded her of the forests that surrounded Raven's Hollow, forests she had always felt drawn to but never dared to explore alone. Forests that, according to local legend, were home to things that were better left undisturbed. "I'm coming," she said, but instead of moving toward the stairs, she found herself drawn to a small trunk pushed against the far wall. Her hands moved without conscious direction, lifting the lid to reveal a collection of items that made her heart stop. Photographs. Dozens of them, showing her mother in various stages of what could only be described as transformation. In the earliest images, her mother looked entirely human, beautiful and young, with the same green eyes Serena saw in her own reflection. But as the photos progressed chronologically, something changed. Her mother's features became more angular, more predatory. Her eyes held a wildness that seemed barely contained. In the final photograph, her mother stood in a moonlit clearing, surrounded by shapes that Serena's rational mind wanted to dismiss as tricks of light and shadow, but that some deeper part of her recognized as wolves. Large wolves with intelligent eyes and postures that spoke of reverence rather than fear. "Serena!" Marcus's voice cracked like a whip, all pretense of paternal warmth stripped away. "Get away from there. Now!" But she couldn't move, couldn't look away from the final image, because in that photo, her mother wasn't entirely human anymore. Her hands had elongated into something between fingers and claws. Her face had shifted into a visage that was both beautiful and terrifying. And her eyes glowed with an inner light that Serena suddenly realized she had seen before, reflected in her own gaze during the full moon nights when sleep eluded her and she found herself staring out at the forest with inexplicable longing. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her mother hadn't died when she was young. Her mother had been driven away, or worse, because of what she was, what they both were. The necklace in her pocket grew warm again, and with that warmth came a flood of sensations that made her gasp. Her hearing expanded until she could detect the heartbeats of small animals in the walls, the whispered conversations of neighbors 3 houses away, and most terrifyingly, the sound of multiple footsteps ascending the stairs behind Marcus. He hadn't come alone. Fear and rage warred in her chest, but underneath both emotions was something else, something that felt like recognition, like coming home. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in science and logic, tried to deny what the photographs and her own awakening senses were telling her, but that part was growing smaller by the minute, overwhelmed by instincts that had been suppressed for too long. "You killed her." The words left her lips before she realized she was going to speak them, and they carried a certainty that surprised her. "You killed my mother because of what she was." Marcus appeared in the attic doorway, his face pale but determined. Behind him stood 2 other men she recognized as community elders, both carrying expressions of grim resolve. They looked like an execution squad, and perhaps that's exactly what they were. "Your mother was dangerous," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of years of justification. "She couldn't control what she was becoming. She would have destroyed everything we've built here, everything we've protected." "What am I?" Serena stood slowly, the photographs clutched in her fists. The necklace against her chest had grown so warm it was almost burning, but the pain felt good, felt right. "What did you steal from me?" One of the elders, a man named Thomas, whose family had lived in Raven's Hollow for generations, stepped forward. "You're an abomination," he said simply, "just like she was. But unlike her, you still have a choice. Come with us willingly, submit to the cleansing ritual, and you can live a normal life. Resist, and you'll suffer her fate." The cleansing ritual. The phrase sent ice through her veins, even as her body temperature seemed to rise. She had heard whispers of such things, ceremonies performed in secret to rid individuals of supernatural influences. But the way Thomas said it, with such casual brutality, told her that whatever they had done to her mother had been far from merciful. "She's already too far gone," the second elder muttered, his eyes fixed on her with undisguised fear. "Look at her eyes, Marcus. The change has already begun." Serena caught her reflection in the dusty window and gasped. Her eyes, normally a soft green, now held flecks of gold that seemed to swirl and dance in the dim light. But more than that, they held a predator's intensity, a wildness that she could feel spreading through her entire being, like fire through dry wood. "The necklace," Marcus breathed, his face going even paler. "Where did you find it?" She clutched the photographs tighter, feeling the paper crinkle beneath her fingers that suddenly seemed longer, stronger than before. "Where you couldn't destroy it, where my mother made sure I would find it when the time was right." Because that's what had happened, she realized with sudden clarity. Her mother had hidden the necklace, had somehow ensured that it would call to Serena when her transformation began. The timing wasn't coincidental. Everything was connected, part of a plan that had been set in motion years ago. "Give it to me," Marcus ordered, extending his hand. "Give it to me, and we can still save you. We can still prevent you from becoming the monster she was." Monster. The word should have hurt, should have filled her with shame and self-doubt. Instead, it filled her with defiant pride. If her mother was a monster, she had been a magnificent one. If this was her legacy, then Serena would embrace it, rather than let these men destroy another generation of her bloodline. "No!" The word came out as almost a growl, and she saw all three men take an involuntary step backward. Power was building inside her, power that had been dormant for too long and was now awakening with a vengeance. "I won't let you murder me the way you murdered her." "We didn't murder anyone," Thomas protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The ritual was for the good of the community. She couldn't be allowed to corrupt others, to spread her influence. But Serena was no longer listening to their justifications. The necklace had grown so warm, it was nearly scalding, and with that heat came visions that made the earlier ones seem like pale shadows. She saw her mother's final night, saw the terror and betrayal in her eyes as the people she had trusted, people she had called friends, surrounded her with silver chains and cold iron blades. She saw the ritual they spoke of so clinically, saw what they had really done to her mother in the name of protecting their precious community. And she felt something inside herself break, or perhaps finally heal, as rage and power merged into something that made the walls of the small attic seem to vibrate with energy. "You're going to pay," she whispered, and her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for a human throat to produce. "All of you, you're going to pay for what you did to her." Marcus reached for something inside his jacket, probably a weapon designed specifically for creatures like her, but Serena was already moving. The transformation that had been building inside her for weeks, months, perhaps years, finally broke free. Her body stretched and changed, muscles elongating and strengthening, senses expanding until she could perceive every detail of the world around her with crystal clarity. The photographs scattered as she leaped, not toward the stairs where the men waited, but toward the window. Glass shattered around her as she burst through it, landing in the garden below with inhuman grace. Behind her, she heard Marcus shouting orders, heard the sound of phones being dialed and vehicles starting. They would hunt her. Of course they would, just as they had hunted her mother. But Serena was no longer the naive veterinarian who had climbed those stairs an hour ago. She was something far more dangerous, something that carried 26 years of suppressed instincts and the burning need for justice. The necklace around her throat pulsed with each heartbeat, connecting her to power that stretched back through generations of women who had been hunted, killed, and forgotten. She ran toward the forest that had always called to her, toward the darkness that no longer seemed threatening, but welcoming. Behind her, the lights of Raven's Hollow flickered like dying stars, and she knew that by the time the moon rose full tomorrow night, everything in her world would be forever changed. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated as she disappeared into the shadows between the trees, was that she wasn't alone in her transformation. Others in the community carried similar bloodlines, similar secrets that Marcus and his allies had worked for decades to suppress. And one of those others had been waiting for her awakening, planning for this moment when the last resistance of the wild heart would finally break free and reclaim what had been stolen from their kind. The forest welcomed Serena like a mother's embrace, its ancient darkness wrapping around her transformed body with an intimacy that should have terrified her, but instead felt like coming home. Every step deeper into the woods brought new sensations, new understanding of abilities that had been dormant for too long. Her enhanced hearing picked up the subtle communications between night creatures. Her improved vision turned the moonless forest into a landscape of silver and shadow, and her newly awakened instincts guided her towards something she couldn't yet name, but desperately needed to find. 3 hours had passed since her escape, and the sounds of pursuit had faded into distant memory. Marcus and his hunters were skilled at tracking ordinary prey, but Serena was no longer ordinary. She moved through the undergrowth like liquid shadow, leaving no trace of her passage save for the occasional scent marker that only another of her kind would recognize. And somewhere in the vast network of forest paths and hidden clearings, she sensed that another of her kind was indeed waiting. The silver necklace against her skin had stopped burning and now pulsed with a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. With each pulse came flashes of inherited memory, glimpses of knowledge that belonged to generations of women who had walked these same paths under different moons. She saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, when her ancestors had served as guardians of the boundary between the human world and something far older, far wilder. But those memories also carried warnings. The balance her lineage had once maintained had been shattered by fear, by the systematic persecution of anyone who carried the old blood. Marcus and his predecessors had spent decades hunting down and eliminating the Guardian families, convinced that they were protecting humanity from an ancient threat. What they had actually done was remove the only force capable of keeping far darker things at bay. A branch snapped somewhere to her left, and Serena froze, every sense focused on the source of the sound. The footsteps that followed were deliberate, unafraid, carrying the confident rhythm of someone who belonged in these woods as much as she did. But underneath that confidence was something else, something that made her newly awakened predator instincts prick with interest rather than alarm. "You can stop hiding," a voice called out, low and rich with an accent she couldn't place. "I know you're there, and I know what you're going through. The transformation is never easy, especially when it happens so late." Serena remained motionless, pressed against the trunk of an oak tree older than the settlement of Raven's Hollow itself. The voice belonged to a man, but not one of Marcus's hunters. This stranger moved through the forest with the same fluid grace she was still learning to control, and his scent carried notes of pine, rain, and something indefinably wild that made her body respond in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "Your mother spoke of you," the voice continued, closer now. "Before they killed her, she told me about the daughter she'd hidden, the child she'd protected by making everyone believe she was dead. She made me promise to find you when your time came." The words hit Serena like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of the last 26 years. Her mother hadn't just hidden the necklace. She had arranged for someone to guide Serena through what she was experiencing now. But that meant her mother had known she was going to die, had accepted her fate to ensure her daughter's survival. "Who are you?" Serena called out, stepping from behind the tree into a small clearing where moonlight filtered through the canopy in patches of silver and black. The man who emerged from the shadows was nothing like what she had expected. Tall and lean, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light and eyes that reflected it like mirrors. He moved with a predator's fluid grace that made her transformation seem clumsy by comparison. But it was his face that made her breath catch, features that were classically handsome, yet marked by a wildness that spoke of someone who had long ago stopped pretending to be entirely human. "My name is Darius," he said, and even in those simple words she heard layers of meaning, promises and threats wrapped in silk. "I'm what your mother was, what you're becoming, and what Marcus fears most of all." He was a wolf. Not like her, not someone caught between two natures, but fully transformed, fully accepted, fully dangerous. The realization should have sent her running, but instead it drew her closer. Here was someone who could answer the questions that were burning through her mind, someone who understood the hunger and confusion and terrible beauty of what she was experiencing. "You knew my mother," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Eleanor was my pack sister," Darius replied, his voice softening with old pain. "We weren't related by blood, but we shared the same territory, the same responsibilities. When she chose to have a child with a human, I warned her it would bring danger to us all. Pack sister." The term resonated through Serena's consciousness like a bell, bringing with it understanding that felt ancient and absolute. Her mother hadn't been alone in her nature. She had been part of a community, a family that extended beyond blood ties into something deeper and more fundamental. "Were you there?" The question emerged as barely a whisper. "When they killed her?" Darius's expression darkened, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that made her realize just how much control he was exercising to appear civilized. "I was hunting in the Northern Territories when it happened. By the time I returned, Marcus and his people had already performed their cleansing ritual. I found her body 3 days later, left in the deep woods, where they thought no one would ever discover what they had done." The image his words created made rage flare through Serena's chest like wildfire, her mother alone and betrayed, dying at the hands of people she had trusted. People who had probably smiled at her in the street, accepted her help as a healer, benefited from her protection of their community from threats they couldn't even comprehend. 23 years, Darius continued, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. 23 years I've waited for you to awaken, knowing that Helena's sacrifice would only mean something if her daughter survived to reclaim her birthright. "What birthright?" Serena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The territory," he said simply. "Raven's Hollow and the surrounding lands have been under our protection for over 3 centuries. Your bloodline established the original pacts with the human settlers, created the boundaries that keep darker things from crossing into inhabited areas. Marcus and his predecessors have spent decades dismantling those protections, convincing themselves that they're safer without us." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the forest that made every nerve in Serena's body scream with alarm. It was a howl, but not from any wolf she could imagine. This cry carried notes of hunger and malevolence that spoke of something that had never been human, never been bound by the restraints that civilization imposed on its predators. Darius moved instantly, placing himself between Serena and the direction of the sound. His body shifted subtly, muscles rippling beneath his skin as he prepared for transformation. "They're testing the boundaries," he said grimly. Without the guardian families to maintain the old protections, things that have been kept in the deep wilderness for generations are starting to probe for weaknesses. What things? Serena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Shadow wolves, he replied, his voice barely audible over the wind through the trees. Creatures that were wolves once, but were corrupted by forces that predate human civilization. They feed on fear and suffering, and they've been contained in the deepest parts of the forest for so long that they're starving. Another howl joined the first, closer this time, followed by a third and fourth, until the night air thrummed with predatory voices that made Serena's newly awakened instincts scream with warnings. But alongside the fear was something else, something that felt like recognition. These creatures were connected to her heritage, part of the responsibility her bloodline had carried for generations. My mother fought them, she said with sudden certainty. Every guardian family did, Darius confirmed. It was our primary duty, the reason human settlements could exist safely in these mountains. But with most of the bloodlines eliminated, the protective barriers have been weakening for years. Tonight, with your awakening, they've finally found a breach. The implications of his words hit her like cold water. Her transformation hadn't just changed her personally. It had altered the supernatural landscape of the entire region. Whatever Marcus and his allies thought they were protecting, they had actually been dismantling the very defenses that kept their community safe. How do we stop them? She asked, surprised by her own acceptance of responsibility she had never asked for. Darius studied her face in the shifting moonlight, and she saw approval in his expression. The old ways require blood bonding between guardian families to maintain the barriers. Your awakening has activated one node of the network, but without at least one other bloodline to anchor the protections, the breach will continue to widen. Are there others? Serena asked, hope and desperation warring in her chest. I believe so, he said carefully. Marcus has been thorough, but he's also been operating in secret. Some families may have gone underground, hidden their children the way your mother hid you. The problem is identifying them before the shadow wolves break through completely. A new sound cut through the night, different from the howling but no less ominous. The distant rumble of vehicles approaching through the forest, headlights sweeping between the trees like searching eyes. Marcus had organized a hunting party, and they were closing in on the clearing where Serena and Darius stood. They'll have silver bullets, Darius said grimly. Weapons blessed by whatever twisted version of the old rituals they still remember. We need to move. But even as he spoke, Serena felt something inside herself rebel against the idea of running again. She had spent 26 years being protected, hidden, kept ignorant of her true nature while her people were systematically eliminated. The thought of fleeing while shadow wolves tested the boundaries and her mother's murderers closed in on them filled her with a fury that made her bones ache with the need for transformation. No, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the trees around them seem to lean closer. I'm done running, I'm done hiding. If my mother died to protect this place, then it's time I learned how to do the same. Darius's eyes widened as he felt the power building around her, power that even she hadn't realized she possessed. The silver necklace against her skin began to glow with soft light, its ancient symbols shifting and moving as if they were alive. But more than that, she could feel something responding to her presence, something vast and patient that had been waiting for her return. The forest itself was awakening. Serena, Darius breathed, his voice filled with awe and concern. What you're attempting requires training, preparation. The Guardian protocols are complex, dangerous if performed incorrectly. Then teach me, she said, stepping closer to him as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Quickly, he studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with the decisiveness of someone who had learned to make life or death choices in seconds. Place your hands on the oak, he instructed, gesturing to the ancient tree at the center of the clearing. The network runs through the root systems of the oldest trees. If any of the protective nodes are still active, you should be able to sense them. Serena pressed her palms against the rough bark and immediately felt the forest's pulse beneath her fingertips. It was like touching a living electrical grid, one that stretched for miles in every direction and connected every growing thing in a web of shared consciousness. But large sections of that web were dark, severed by the elimination of the guardian families who had once maintained them. "I can feel them," she whispered, her eyes closing as she concentrated on the network's subtle currents. 3 nodes are still active, but they're failing. And there's something else, something trying to break through from the other side. The Shadow Wolves had found the weak points and were systematically attacking them, using their unnatural hunger to corrode the barriers from within. But as Serena reached deeper into the network, she sensed something that made her heart race with hope. "There's someone else," she said, her eyes snapping open to meet Darius's intense gaze. "Another bloodline, awakening right now. The network is responding to 2 sources instead of 1. Before he could respond, the first vehicle broke through the tree line, its headlights sweeping across the clearing like searchlights. Marcus's voice carried through the night air, amplified by a bullhorn and filled with righteous authority. "Serena Kane, you are in violation of community safety protocols. Surrender yourself for purification, and no further harm will come to you or your accomplices." Purification. The euphemism they used for murder made Serena's newly awakened predator instinct surge with protective fury. But alongside that fury came something else, something that felt like the forest itself responding to the threat against its guardian. "The other bloodline," Darius said urgently, his hand closing around her wrist. "Where are they?" Serena concentrated on the network again, following the threads of power to their source. "Close," she breathed. "Very close. They're at the old veterinary clinic on the edge of town." Understanding flashed across Darius's face. "Dr. Elena Morrison," he said. "Of course, I should have realized she was more than she appeared." The veterinary clinic where Serena had worked, where she had always felt most comfortable, where the animals had always responded to her with unusual trust. Elena Morrison, the older woman who had taken Serena under her wing 5 years ago, who had taught her healing techniques that seemed to work better than conventional medicine should have allowed. "She's been protecting me," Serena realized. "All this time, she's been part of the network, keeping the clinic as a safe haven. And now her awakening is synchronized with yours," Darius said grimly. "That's not coincidence. The network is responding to the crisis by activating all remaining Guardian bloodlines simultaneously." More vehicles were arriving, surrounding the clearing with a wall of light and armed men. But as they did, the howling from the deep forest grew louder, more urgent. The Shadow Wolves could sense that something was changing, that their opportunity to break through might be slipping away. "We have to reach Elena," Serena said, her connection to the forest network showing her glimpses of what was happening at the clinic. She could see the older woman surrounded by the same silver light that was emanating from her own necklace, could feel her confusion and fear as power she had kept buried for decades suddenly erupted into her consciousness. "She's alone," Darius said, his enhanced hearing picking up sounds from the direction of town. "Marcus sent most of his people here, but he left enough behind to handle any other incidents that might arise. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Use Serena's awakening to draw out any other Guardian bloodlines, then eliminate them all in a single coordinated strike." Marcus hadn't just been hunting supernatural creatures, he had been orchestrating a genocide that would leave his community completely defenseless against the very threats his predecessors had sworn to contain. "The Shadow Wolves will break through before dawn," Serena said with certainty that came from her deepening connection to the forest. "If Eleanor and I don't establish the Guardian bond before then, nothing will be able to stop them from overrunning the entire valley." Darius nodded grimly, his own transformation beginning as Marcus's men closed their circle around the clearing. "Then we go to her." But first, we go through them. As he spoke, his body shifted and flowed into its wolf form, revealing the magnificent creature that had been hidden beneath human appearance. But Serena barely had time to admire his transformation before her own change began, triggered by necessity and fueled by 26 years of suppressed instincts, finally set free. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers for generations, though few would believe the stories were anything more than folklore designed to frighten children away from the deep woods after dark. The transformation that overtook Serena was nothing like the gradual awakening she had experienced in the attic. This was volcanic, primal, a complete surrender to instincts that had been compressed into her bones for generations. Her human form dissolved like mist before dawn, replaced by something that was both wolf and more than wolf, a creature of silver light and ancient power that made the very air around her crackle with energy. Beside her, Darius's transformation was equally magnificent but controlled, the result of decades of practice and acceptance. Together, they were no longer just two supernatural beings surrounded by human hunters. They were the embodiment of an ancient covenant, guardians awakened in the hour of greatest need. Marcus's men opened fire the moment they saw the transformations begin, but their bullets passed through spaces where flesh and fur had been only seconds before. Serena moved like liquid lightning, her enhanced form allowing her to flow between the gunshots as if they were falling raindrops. But it wasn't just speed that protected her. The network of forest energy was responding to her presence, bending reality around her in ways that defied human understanding. "Silver bullets won't stop them," one of the hunters screamed, his voice cracking with terror as he watched his shots pass harmlessly through Serena's shifting form. "They're not just wolves anymore." Marcus himself stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of disbelief and growing horror. For decades, he had convinced himself that the creatures he hunted were abominations, parasites feeding on human civilization. But what he was witnessing now was something far more complex, far more powerful than his limited understanding had allowed him to grasp. "Fall back," he commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. Some part of him, the part that remembered childhood stories told by grandparents who still believed in the old ways, recognized what he was seeing. These weren't monsters to be eliminated. They were forces of nature that his ancestors had learned to respect, to work with, rather than against. But it was too late for understanding, too late for the reconciliation that might have been possible if he had chosen wisdom over fear decades ago. The Shadow Wolves had felt the barriers weaken during the confrontation, and their assault on the remaining protective nodes intensified with predatory cunning. Serena felt each attack like a physical blow, the network's pain resonating through her consciousness with nauseating intensity. Elena was fighting her own battle at the veterinary clinic, her awakening guardian powers barely holding back creatures that had been contained for centuries. Without the bond between their bloodlines, both defensive positions would fall before sunrise. "The clinic," she managed to communicate to Darius through the wordless connection that existed between their transformed states. "Elena won't last much longer alone." His response came as a surge of understanding and determination. Together, they abandoned the clearing, where Marcus's confused and terrified hunters were regrouping, flowing through the forest like twin streams of moonlight. Behind them, the sound of pursuit faded quickly as ordinary humans found themselves unable to track creatures that moved according to laws older than civilization. But ahead of them, new sounds were rising from the direction of Raven's Hollow. Screams of terror, the crash of breaking glass, and underneath it all the triumphant howling of things that had tasted freedom after decades of imprisonment. The Shadow Wolves had found their breach. The veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the kind of open meadows that should have made it defensible. Instead, the lack of cover had left Elena exposed to attack from multiple directions. As Serena and Darius approached, they could see silver light pouring from every window of the building, but that light was flickering, weakening with each assault from the creatures circling the structure. Elena Morrison, the gentle veterinarian who had mentored Serena for 5 years, was no longer recognizable as the quiet woman who had devoted her life to healing injured animals. Her guardian form was magnificent and terrible, a creature of pure silver energy that fought with the desperation of someone making their final stand. But she was exhausted, her power draining rapidly as she maintained barriers against enemies that multiplied with each passing moment. The shadow wolves themselves defied easy description. They retained the basic shape of wolves, but their substance seemed to shift between solid flesh and living darkness. Their eyes burned with hunger that went beyond physical need, a spiritual emptiness that sought to consume light, hope, and life itself. They had been the nightmares that lurked at the edges of human consciousness since the dawn of memory, contained only by the vigilance of guardian bloodlines that had paid for that protection with generations of sacrifice. "There are too many," Darius said as they crouched at the edge of the meadow, assessing the battle. "Even with the 3 of us, we can't fight them all directly." But Serena was no longer thinking like someone who fought individual battles. Her connection to the forest network had deepened during their flight from the clearing, and she could feel the entire structure of protective barriers that had once covered the region like a vast web. Most of the nodes were dark, destroyed when their guardian families were eliminated, but the underlying framework remained intact. "We don't fight them," she said, her voice carrying certainties that came from inherited knowledge she was only beginning to understand. "We repair the network, force them back to where they belong. That requires blood bonding between at least 3 guardian lines," Darius replied. "And we don't have a third." As if summoned by his words, new movement caught their attention from the direction of town. A figure was running toward the clinic with inhuman speed, moving with the same fluid grace that marked their kind. But this newcomer was smaller, younger, and carried themselves with the uncertainty of someone whose awakening was even more recent than Serena's. "Thomas Blackwood's son," Darius breathed with amazement. The boy survived after all. Adrian Blackwood, barely 21 and heir to a bloodline that Marcus had believed completely eliminated, burst from the tree line like a force of nature. His transformation was wild, uncontrolled, fueled by terror and rage as he saw his town under attack by creatures from his worst nightmares. But underneath the chaos of his awakening was power that resonated with the same ancient frequencies that connected Serena to the forest network. "3 bloodlines," Serena said with fierce satisfaction. "It's enough." What followed next would have seemed impossible to anyone who still believed that the world operated according to rational, scientific principles. As the 3 guardians converged on the veterinary clinic, their individual powers began to resonate with each other, creating harmonics that made the very ground beneath their feet thrum with energy. Elena's silver barriers, which had been failing under the constant assault of shadow wolves, suddenly blazed with renewed strength. But more than that, similar barriers began flickering to life at other points around the valley, ghost echoes of the protective network that had once covered the entire region. The shadow wolves felt the change immediately, their howls shifting from triumph to frustration and growing fear. For the first time in decades, they were facing the coordinated response of guardian bloodlines, working in harmony rather than individual supernatural beings fighting alone. "Now!" Serena commanded, her voice carrying across the meadow with authority that surprised even her. "Form the triangle." The blood bonding ritual was older than written history, passed down through genetic memory, and awakened only when guardian bloodlines came together in times of greatest need. As the 3 of them positioned themselves at the points of an equilateral triangle, with Elena's clinic at its center, power began to flow between them in visible streams of silver fire. The sensation was unlike anything Serena had ever experienced. She could feel Darius's decades of experience and hard-won wisdom flowing into her consciousness, while Adrian's raw, untrained power provided the pure energy needed to bridge gaps in the network that had been dark for years. And from Elena came something else, something that made Serena's heart clench with recognition and loss. Memories of her mother. Elena had known Helena, had been part of the same guardian circle before Marcus's persecution forced them all into hiding. Through Elena's recollections, Serena finally saw her mother as she truly had been, not a monster or an abomination, but a protector who had died defending people who feared and hated her for the very qualities that made their safety possible. She would be so proud. Elena's voice whispered through their shared connection. You're everything she hoped you would become. But even as the bonding ritual progressed, the Shadow Wolves were mounting their most desperate assault yet. They could sense that their opportunity was slipping away, that the breach they had worked so hard to widen was beginning to close. Their attacks on the forming barriers became frenzied, suicidal, as they threw themselves against protections that grew stronger with each passing moment. One of the largest Shadow Wolves, a creature that had once been an alpha before its corruption, managed to break through Elena's outer defenses. It materialized inside the clinic itself, its form solidifying into something that was part wolf, part living shadow, and part nightmare, given flesh. Its eyes locked onto the three guardians performing their ritual, and it gathered itself for a leap that would shatter their concentration and doom the entire valley to darkness. But it had underestimated the bond that was forming between them. As the creature launched itself towards Serena, all three guardians moved as one, their individual powers combining into something far greater than the sum of its parts. The Shadow Wolf struck a barrier of pure light and was instantly incinerated, its scream of rage and hunger cut short, as it was reduced to nothing more than ash scattered on the wind. The destruction of their alpha sent shockwaves through the remaining Shadow Wolves, but more importantly, it completed the circuit of power that the Guardians had been building. The restored network blazed to life across the entire valley, barriers snapping back into place with an audible crack that echoed off the surrounding mountains. One by one, the Shadow Wolves were pulled back toward the deep wilderness, dragged by forces they could no longer resist. Their howls of fury and frustration faded into the distance as they were returned to the primordial forests where they belonged, contained once again by protections that would hold as long as the Guardian bloodlines remained vigilant. But the victory came with a price that became apparent as the immediate crisis passed. The ritual had drained all three of them to the point of near collapse, and maintaining the restored network would require ongoing sacrifice from each Guardian line. They would never again be able to live purely human lives, never be able to ignore the call of their ancestral duties. It's not over, Darius said, as they helped each other to their feet in the aftermath of the battle. His voice was hoarse with exhaustion, but underneath the weariness was a satisfaction that spoke of a burden finally shared. Marcus and his followers won't simply accept what happened here tonight. He was right. Even as dawn broke over Raven's Hollow, revealing the extent of the damage caused by the Shadow Wolves' brief freedom, vehicles were approaching from the direction of town. Marcus had survived the night, and he was bringing reinforcements. But Serena no longer felt the terror that his approach would have inspired just hours ago. She was no longer alone, no longer ignorant of her true nature, no longer at the mercy of people who sought to eliminate what they couldn't understand. She stood with Elena and Adrian, three Guardian bloodlines united in purpose, while Darius's presence provided the experience and knowledge they would need to navigate the challenges ahead. "Let them come," she said, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the silver necklace that had started her transformation. It's time this community learned the truth about the protections they've been trying so hard to destroy. The confrontation that followed would reshape everything about life in Raven's Hollow, forcing its inhabitants to choose between the comfortable lies they had been fed for decades and the difficult truths that their survival actually depended upon. Some, like Marcus, would never be able to accept that their crusade against the supernatural had been built on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of good and evil. But others, particularly the younger generation, who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the old ways, would recognize the Guardians for what they truly were, the last line of defense against threats that civilization was neither equipped nor prepared to handle alone. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Serena felt the network's pulse settling into a steady rhythm that would guide her for the rest of her life. She had awakened to her heritage in the most dramatic way possible, but the awakening was only the beginning. Ahead lay years of learning to balance her human nature with her guardian responsibilities, of building relationships with others who shared her calling, and of gradually expanding the protective network to cover territories where it had been lost. But perhaps most importantly, ahead lay the chance to honor her mother's memory by ensuring that no future generation of guardian children would grow up ignorant of their heritage, vulnerable to the fears and prejudices of those they had sworn to protect. The last resistance of the wild heart had finally broken free, and in breaking free, it had revealed itself to be not resistance at all, but acceptance of a destiny that ran deeper than individual choice, deeper than human understanding, deeper than the petty conflicts that had nearly destroyed everything their ancestors had built. Serena Elena Kane, daughter of Helena, heir to an ancient bloodline, stood ready to write the next chapter in a story that stretched back to the dawn of memory and forward into a future where the balance between worlds would be maintained by those brave enough to straddle the line between human and something infinitely more wild, more powerful, and more necessary than civilization had ever imagined possible. The Shadow Wolves were contained, the network was restored, and the Guardians had returned to reclaim their birthright. But in the growing light of dawn, new challenges were already stirring, new threats emerging from corners of the supernatural world that had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment of transition. The battle for Raven's Hollow was over, but the war for the future of both worlds was just beginning.